At the business meeting, no one understood the sheikh until the black cleaning lady replied in Arabic. It was just past 7 o'clock in the morning, and the 40th floor of the glass tower on Park Avenue was already awake. The city outside pulsed with the rhythm of horns and footsteps, but in here, the world moved in polished silence. A scent of lavender wax and bitter espresso lingered in the air. The marble floors, still damp from the morning cleaning, reflected the fluorescent lights like frozen water. Air conditioning hummed faintly, a sterile, regulated breath of a place where no one ever raised their voice. Martha Johnson pushed her cleaning cart slowly along the hallway. Her white sneakers barely made a sound on the floor. She had done this every weekday for over 20 years, same routine, same steps, same quiet smile. Her fingers, rough from years of scrubbing, wrapped around a spray bottle like it was a part of her body. She moved with the grace of someone who knew every corner, every smudge before it even appeared. In her cart, tucked behind the mop and detergent, a small radio whispered old soul music, barely audible, just enough to color the silence. Most mornings, the building's executives passed her like she was furniture. A nod, a polite smile, sometimes not even that. Martha didn't take offense. She had learned long ago that invisibility came with the uniform. She carried it like a second skin, but today was not like other days. Down the corridor, past the frosted glass doors of the main conference room, something was different. The air was too still, too sharp. Martha felt it before she saw it, the way the assistant at the reception desk stiffened, the way the security guard stopped tapping on his phone, and then a voice, deep, commanding, speaking in rapid Arabic, not loud, but firm, confident, angry. Inside the room, 12 men in tailored suits sat around an obsidian conference table. The lights were dimmed to reduce glare on the screen behind them, but even in the shadows, the tension was visible. Eyes darted, hands fidgeted with pens, buttons, wrists. A glass of sparkling water, untouched, vibrated with the hum of a phone on silent. At the head of the table sat a man draped in white. The fabric of his robes flowed like smoke, uncreased, untouched by time. A golden gull circled his head, and his dark eyes scanned the room with quiet judgment. The Sheikh, a name everyone had whispered all week, a billionaire investor from the Gulf, known for sealing deals that reshaped cities. And now, he sat silent, arms crossed, lips pressed into a line. He had stopped speaking. No one understood why. The interpreter had not shown up. Some paperwork mistake, a broken chain in the machine, but no one dared to admit it. Whispers filled the room in English, nervous, rehearsed, desperate. "We need a translator. Call someone. Does anyone speak Arabic?" Silence. Then a forced laugh from the youngest executive, hoping to diffuse the weight. It fell flat. No one joined. Martha, still holding her mop, stood outside the half-open door. She wasn't supposed to hear, but she had heard everything. Her hands trembled slightly. Inside, one of the VPs cleared his throat. "We're sorry, sir, we're arranging a—" The Sheikh spoke again, low and unmistakably irritated. And then it happened. A voice, soft but clear, cut through the room. He said he's offended that no one thought to provide a translator. Every pair of eyes turned. The CEO frowned. "Who said that?" The young assistant looked around. I don't know." There was a pause, heavy, breathless. Then a slow shift of heads toward the door. Martha stood there, framed by the threshold like a ghost that had become flesh. Her cleaning gloves were still on. Her eyes, warm and worn, met theirs without flinching. "I did," she said quietly. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the room had been turned upside down. She was not supposed to speak. Not here. Not now. Not her. And yet, here she was, standing between two worlds, holding a mop in one hand and a language no one else could understand in the other. The contrast was jarring. The Sheikh, a man of immense wealth and power, and Martha, a woman long unseen, now holding the thread that could mend this broken moment. She, whose name most of them had never bothered to learn, now spoke for the only person in the room who truly mattered. Something shifted. A crack, small but real, in the order of things. The Sheikh looked at her, not with surprise, not with offense, but with recognition, the kind that says, "I see you." She took a step back, unsure. The mop squeaked on the tile. No one said anything. The room was still frozen in the impossible image of a cleaning lady breaking a multi-million-dollar silence. Somewhere far below, a taxi honked. The city kept moving. But up here in this tower of glass and certainty, the air had changed. It would never go back to what it was. Not after this. The hallway outside the conference room remained still for a long moment after Martha's voice echoed into silence. As if the walls themselves were struggling to process what had just happened. Inside, the suits and ties were frozen, not in anger, not quite, but in disbelief, the kind that lingers when the world takes an unexpected turn and the compass spins without a direction. Martha, suddenly exposed under the fluorescent lights, felt their eyes upon her like wind through a thin coat. Yet she didn't shrink. Not anymore. She turned away from the door, cart squeaking slightly, and began walking down the corridor as if nothing had happened. But her heart, steady as a pendulum most days, now beat with an unfamiliar urgency. Not fear exactly, not pride either, but something in between. Something like awakening. She rode the service elevator back down, the soft hum of its descent cushioning her thoughts. In the mirror above the panel, she caught her own reflection. A small woman, hair tucked beneath a navy headscarf, lines on her face like rivers that had traveled far. Her brown eyes, rimmed with gentle fatigue, stared back with quiet strength. She had never thought of herself as extraordinary, just someone who did what needed to be done. That was how her father had raised her. He had come to America from Algeria when he was still young. Chasing opportunity, he used to say, though the world had not made it easy. In their small apartment in the Bronx, he spoke Arabic at the table and told stories of sand dunes that sang in the wind, markets filled with spices that danced on your tongue, and stars that blanketed the desert night like stories waiting to be told. Martha had listened with her whole heart, absorbing the sounds, the syllables, the rhythm of a world so far from hers. He had taught her not just the words, but the meaning behind them, the pauses, the dignity, the weight of silence. And now all those memories, once tender ghosts in her mind, had come rushing back like a tide. All because one man in a white robe refused to be ignored. She stepped out onto the loading dock, the morning sun now stretching its golden arms across the concrete. The city was waking up in full, the clatter of delivery trucks and the chatter of commuters painting the day with noise. But for Martha, everything felt quieter, as if a veil had lifted. She walked home that afternoon as she always did, past the bakery where the owner knew her name and always gave her a smile, past the laundromat where old women played cards between wash cycles, past the mural on the corner of Fordham Road where a pair of brown eyes looked out over the neighborhood in bold, defiant color. Her body moved through familiar space, but her thoughts were elsewhere, back in that boardroom, in that moment when everything cracked open. Her apartment smelled of chamomile tea and old books. The floors creaked with age, and the furniture was soft from years of use. Photographs lined the shelves, her daughter as a child, her wedding day with Harold, gone now over 10 years, and one sepia-toned image of her father, young and proud in his military uniform. She stood in front of it for a long time, her fingers brushing the frame. "Papa," she whispered, the Arabic still tender on her tongue. "You gave me something I didn't know I would need." Later, she sat in her favorite chair, the green one by the window, with the armrest worn smooth where her hand always rested, and let the afternoon light spill across her lap. She thought of the executives, their wide eyes, the silence that had followed her words. She wasn't angry at them, not exactly. They hadn't meant harm. They had just never looked, never wondered who she was beneath the uniform. She had cleaned their offices, seen the names on their diplomas, picked up their discarded coffee cups and half-eaten lunches. She knew their favorite takeout spots, their colognes, the times they whispered arguments on their phones, thinking no one could hear. She had been a quiet part of their lives for years, and still not one of them had ever asked her name, until today. But Martha remembered all of them. She remembered the small kindnesses, the receptionist who always said good morning, the young woman in HR who once helped her fill out a complicated form, and she remembered the ones who never looked her in the eye. Still, she hadn't spoken today to prove a point. She had spoken because someone needed to be heard, and because her father had told her, over warm bread and honeyed tea, that silence too can be a form of injustice. That night, as she prepared a modest dinner of lentils and rice, she replayed the moment again and again in her mind. The sound of her own voice, steady, unfamiliar in its courage. She remembered the Sheikh's eyes, the way they had softened, as if, for a moment, he saw not a cleaner, but a bridge between two worlds. And maybe that's what she was, a bridge no one had thought to build. In the quiet of her apartment, her cat curled against her legs, Martha allowed herself to imagine, just for a second, that something might change. Not the world, not all at once, but something small. A door left open, a conversation remembered, a glance that lingered longer than before. The next morning, the elevator doors opened again onto the 40th floor. Same building, same hallway, same cart, wheels turning in rhythm with her steps. But the atmosphere was different, subtle but real. The receptionist gave her a nod, a real one, with meaning behind it. A few heads turned as she passed, eyes curious, watching. Martha said nothing, but something had begun. And in the stillness of her footsteps, a quiet promise lingered, that the days of being unseen were numbered, that the silence she broke was only the beginning. And somewhere deep inside her chest, beneath the years of routine and the layers of humility, a single truth burned quietly. They had heard her once, and they would hear her again. The conference room, once a sanctuary of certainty and protocol, had turned into a fragile theater of glances and whispered doubts. The air was no longer crisp with confidence. It hung dense, thick with the scent of unease. Men shifted in their leather chairs, loosened ties, checked their watches, and dared not speak out of turn. Yet none dared to continue the meeting either, not without the Sheikh's consent, and he remained silent. Martha had returned to her cart. She stood just outside the room now, pretending to adjust the placement of the cleaning bottles, her hands moving out of instinct more than intent. Inside, voices began again, low and strategic, as executives tried to regain control of a negotiation, spiraling into unfamiliar territory. Still, the elephant remained. Not the missing interpreter, not even the cultural offense, but her. A woman no one had seen, now seen too clearly. Her voice, soft and sure, had punctured their rhythm like a crack in glass. For years, Martha had moved through spaces like this one, as though she were not quite real. A necessary presence, functional, silent. But that morning she had not just spoken, she had mattered. And now the memory of that moment refused to dissolve, clinging to the edges of the conversation like a thread no one knew how to pull. Inside the room, the Sheikh stood slowly, his robes, flowing like ivory silk, whispered against the polished floor. He glanced at the lead executive, a tall man with silver at his temples and lines on his forehead that had deepened with every passing minute. The Sheikh said something again in Arabic, his voice patient but firm. A pause followed. No one responded. No one could, not without her. A few feet away, Martha froze. She had understood every word. He was refusing to proceed without proper representation. He felt dismissed, he had said, insulted by their lack of preparedness. He did not blame her. No, she had honored him. But the company, the process, the arrogance of it all, that he could not overlook. The weight of those words sat heavy in Martha's chest. She knew what it meant to be overlooked. She knew it deeply, from years of being treated like a shadow, a figure that filled a task, not a presence that held a life. And now, someone like him, powerful, wealthy, commanding, was saying the same thing, that he too felt unseen. And somehow she had become the bridge between their two invisibilities. But what now? Her hands were shaking, ever so slightly. Not from fear, but from conflict. Should she speak again? Was it her place? She looked down at the grey rubber gloves on her hands, still damp from earlier, and thought of all the times she had been told to keep quiet, to stay in her lane, to be grateful for a job that fed her family. She thought of her daughter, now grown, who had once asked her why she always looked down when people passed her in hallways. And she thought of her father, whose eyes had always said, "You are more than they know." Still, she hesitated. She had made her mark already. Maybe that was enough. Maybe stepping back now would preserve the dignity of the moment. But the voices inside the room grew more frantic, more desperate, and still, no progress. Without understanding, there could be no agreement. Without her, they were stranded in their own pride. And then she heard it. Her name, not whispered, spoken. "Martha," said the receptionist softly, her voice carrying the weight of uncertainty. Martha turned. The young woman looked pale, nervous. They're asking if you could come in." The world seemed to pause again. Martha's heart beat once, hard, then again. The moment hung there, like a fragile ornament, suspended by invisible thread. She nodded, just once. She wiped her hands on her apron, removed her gloves, and walked slowly back to the room where everything had started. As she stepped through the threshold, something strange happened. People moved. They shifted in their seats, opened space for her to pass, looked at her not as an intruder but as someone who, for reasons they could no longer deny, belonged. She approached the table. No one offered her a seat, but she didn't expect one. The sheikh gave her a small nod, one that meant more than words. He spoke again in Arabic, this time with less edge, more curiosity. He asked about the delay, whether they had found a translator. Martha, with her hands gently folded, translated his question in clear, measured English. All heads turned. The CEO responded. They apologized again, profusely, and offered to postpone the meeting until an interpreter could be brought in. The sheikh replied, Martha translated. He said postponing would only show further disorganization. That time was valuable. That trust, once fractured, was difficult to repair. Her voice remained steady, but inside Martha felt the push and pull of every gaze in the room, some skeptical, others surprised, a few respectful. She focused only on the words, on honoring their meaning, because this wasn't about her pride. It was about ensuring that a conversation, one that might shape lives, careers, entire divisions, could actually happen. But then, just as the dialogue began to find its rhythm, it happened. A voice, sharp and cold, sliced through the moment. "This is highly irregular," said one of the senior executives, a man whose presence had always filled the room more than his words ever did. "She's not part of the team. She shouldn't be in here." The room froze. Again. Martha stood still. The sheikh turned slowly toward the man who had spoken. Then, in perfect, deliberate Arabic, he said, "Sometimes the ones who do not wear titles carry the most integrity." Martha translated the sentence. Her voice was calm, but inside her ribs something flickered. Not anger, not sadness, but something deeper. Validation. No one said a word. The executive who had objected looked away. Martha lowered her eyes, not out of submission, but to hold in the tears she felt rising. The sheikh looked at her once more and nodded, this time more deeply. And in that quiet exchange, something shifted again. This was no longer about language or negotiations. It was about presence, about being seen, about the quiet, uncelebrated power of someone who had spent her life listening, and now finally was being heard. She stepped back slightly, no longer needing to stand so close. The conversation continued, slowly, awkwardly at first, but growing steadier with each exchange. Martha remained still, a witness, a guide, not commanding, not demanding, simply there, and impossible to ignore. And though she said little after that, one thing had become clear. The room would never return to what it was before she entered, and neither would she. When the meeting finally ended, the room emptied slowly, like air escaping from a punctured balloon. The executives filed out in silence, each lost in his own thoughts, each avoiding Martha's eyes as though her presence unsettled the fragile order of their world. Only the sheikh lingered, offering her one last measured nod before stepping into the hallway. That small gesture stayed with her long after the echo of his footsteps disappeared. Martha remained by her cart, gripping the handle as though it were the only thing anchoring her to the floor. Her body looked still, but inside her chest was a storm of emotions colliding against one another. For a fleeting moment, she had felt powerful, useful beyond the tasks she had always performed. But now, as the conference room fell quiet again and the fluorescent lights hummed above, a darker voice crept into her mind. "What have you done?" It was the same voice she had heard many times before, the one that whispered when she wanted to ask a question in school but kept her hand down, the one that told her to remain polite when customers ignored her at her old grocery job, the one that had silenced her so often it had almost become second nature. It reminded her that she was a cleaner, nothing more. that stepping out of her place could only end badly, that people like her were expected to serve, not to speak. She wheeled her cart down the long corridor, her shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Each sound seemed to echo her doubts. The men in suits would probably laugh about her later, she thought, maybe in private offices or over drinks that cost more than her weekly groceries. They would call her bold, but not in admiration, in mockery. They might even complain to management. Perhaps tomorrow she would be called into the supervisor's office, asked why she interfered in matters far above her pay grade. Her breath grew shallow as her mind painted scenes of reprimand. She had worked too long, endured too much to risk losing her livelihood. Every paycheck mattered. Every hour she cleaned those offices meant stability. Food on the table, bills paid, her daughter's comfort secured. To put that at risk, even for one moment of recognition, seemed reckless. She entered the service elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and leaned against the metal wall. The reflection staring back at her was familiar and yet not. Same tired eyes, same hair streaked with silver, same lines that mapped the years she had lived. But there was something else now too. A faint glimmer she hadn't seen in a long time, a trace of defiance, of voice. The elevator jolted slightly as it descended, and in that small silence, a memory rose to the surface. Her father's face. He had been a strong man, not tall but with a presence that filled any room. She remembered sitting by his side at their old kitchen table, the scent of cumin and mint rising from the dishes he prepared, his hands guiding hers as she tried to shape words in Arabic. "One day, Martha," he had told her, his accent heavy, but his voice steady, "you will understand why I insist you learn. The world does not always see us, but language is power. If ever the moment comes, do not hide it. Do not hide yourself." She had been only 12 then, her mind restless, her heart not yet bruised by invisibility. She had nodded, but she had not understood. She thought the lessons were simply a way for him to hold on to his homeland, a nostalgia for what he had left behind. She never imagined that decades later, in a room filled with men who would never have glanced twice at her, his words would be the very thing that broke her silence. Yet even as the memory warmed her, the doubt returned like a shadow creeping at her feet. Had she betrayed her place by stepping forward? Would they punish her? Would they strip her of the job that, while humble, had been her anchor all these years? Back in her small apartment, the doubt clung to her like dust she could not sweep away. She placed her shoes neatly by the door, hung her coat, and moved through the familiar space with the same careful rhythm she had kept for decades. She boiled water for tea, the steam curling into the air, and sat by the window where the city lights blinked like distant stars. She thought of the sheikh again, his eyes, dark and knowing, meeting hers with respect. That moment replayed in her mind, both a comfort and a torment. He had thanked her, he had recognized her, but what if his gratitude meant nothing compared to the scorn of the men in suits? Recognition from one man, however powerful, could not erase a lifetime of being invisible to others. Her daughter called later that evening, her voice full of warmth as always. "How was your day, Mama?" she asked. Martha hesitated, her tongue heavy with all she wished to say and all she feared to reveal. She wanted to tell her that she had spoken, that for the first time in years, her voice had filled a room of people who had never listened before. She wanted to say that she had been brave, but instead, she softened the story, telling only that work had been busy, that she was tired, that she would sleep early. She did not want to raise her daughter's hopes, nor risk disappointing her if tomorrow brought consequences. After the call ended, Martha remained by the window, the city's hum filling the silence around her. The doubt gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. Yet beneath it, like a faint ember refusing to die, her father's words glowed. "Do not hide yourself." She whispered them into the night, as though speaking them aloud might give them strength, but her heart still wavered. She did not yet know if courage would grow or if fear would root her silence once more. All she knew was that something had shifted inside her, something that could not be swept back into the shadows. And though doubt clawed at her, a quiet truth remained. She had been seen, and once seen, a person cannot simply disappear again. The morning began like any other. The city roared awake with the restless sound of buses, honking cars and hurried footsteps. But inside the corporate tower, The stillness was rehearsed and controlled. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and polished wood drifted through the halls as assistants carried trays and typed frantically on glowing screens. Yet beneath the surface of that ritualized order, there was a quiet unrest. Everyone knew the sheikh would be back at the negotiating table, and without a translator, the entire deal remained at risk. Martha walked into the building with her cart, as she always did, her sneakers pressing softly against the spotless floors. To an outsider, she was just another part of the invisible machinery that kept the place pristine. Yet inside her chest, a battle raged. The words of her father had followed her through the night, threading through her dreams and stirring her awake before dawn. "Do not hide yourself." Over and over, the phrase had played in her mind until it was no longer only memory, it was a command. Still, doubt clung to her like the scent of cleaning solution on her hands. She knew too well the dangers of stepping outside one's assigned place. She had witnessed colleagues dismissed for less, a misplaced comment, a hint of defiance. She had no illusions about her own position, yet she also carried a truth deeper than fear, that silence was no longer an option. She had tasted what it meant to be heard, and though the weight of doubt was heavy, the pull of courage had grown stronger. When she reached the corridor of the conference room, the atmosphere was electric. Suits lined the hallway, assistants hurried back and forth, and the receptionist who had called her name the day before gave her a quick glance, half curious, half cautious. Inside the room, the sheikh's voice was already rising in Arabic, steady and insistent. The executives, once confident in their rehearsed pitches, now sat stiff, their eyes darting like trapped animals searching for escape. Martha's heart pounded. She stood with her cart at the edge of the hallway, hidden in plain sight, listening. She understood every word spilling from the sheikh's lips. He was not here for games. He was not a man who tolerated disrespect. He would walk away, not tomorrow, not later, but now, if he felt unheard once more. Her hands trembled against the cart handle. She could stay silent. She could let the moment pass, keep her head low, continue mopping and dusting until the building swallowed her back into routine. But then what? Another day of invisibility, another night of regret, another memory of her father's lessons left unspoken. She closed her eyes briefly and remembered his kitchen table, the way his hands guided hers as she shaped the strange but beautiful words, the way his voice carried both sternness and tenderness as he told her that knowledge was not something to bury, but something to honor. She thought of her daughter too, the one who had grown up watching her mother bend so often, stay silent so often, always putting others first. What lesson would she leave behind if she turned away now? That silence was safer than truth. That invisibility was easier than dignity. Her chest lifted with a slow breath, and then she let go of the cart. The squeak of her sneakers on the floor was almost inaudible, but to her it sounded like thunder. Step after step she moved toward the conference room, each footfall steadying her, strengthening her. The door loomed ahead, heavy with polished glass and brushed steel, a barrier she had never crossed without permission. Yet today she did not wait for permission. She opened it. The room fell silent. The executives looked up sharply, irritation etched across their faces, as though the intrusion of a cleaner during such a delicate moment was almost unbearable. The sheikh, however, did not show irritation. His gaze shifted, calm and steady, as if he had been waiting. Martha walked forward, not rushing, not shrinking. She stopped near the edge of the table, her hands folded in front of her. Her voice, when it came, was soft but unwavering. "He says he is willing to renegotiate," she began, her English clear, her tone respectful. "But he asks that his words be heard with dignity." The silence that followed was unlike any before. It was not the silence of confusion or delay. It was the silence of recognition. The executives, startled, leaned back slightly, eyes widening at the precision of her words. The sheikh's expression softened, almost imperceptibly, but enough for Martha to notice. The CEO cleared his throat, his voice cautious. "And he said that?" Martha nodded, translating again, this time with more detail, her Arabic flowing easily, her English carrying the same weight. The sheikh inclined his head, confirming her words. Something shifted. The air, once thick with tension, loosened. The executives leaned forward, now listening, truly listening, to words they could not have accessed without her. For the first time, Martha was not a shadow in the room. She was the bridge that held it together. But what struck her most was not their surprise, nor even the Sheikh's approval. It was the feeling within herself. Standing there, voice steady, language flowing through her like a gift passed down generations, she felt something she had not felt in decades. Freedom. Not from work, not from responsibility, but from invisibility. For once, she was not a woman with a mop and gloves. She was a daughter carrying her father's legacy, a mother showing her child that courage had no age, no uniform, no boundaries. She was seen. The negotiation continued, haltingly at first, then more fluidly, with Martha at its heart. And as she translated each sentence, each demand, each concession, she realized something profound. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to step forward, even while fear pressed against your chest. And in that room, under the cold glow of corporate lights, Martha Johnson chose courage. What none of them knew, not the Sheikh, not the executives, not even Martha herself, was that this choice would change everything. It would rewrite not only the course of the meeting, but the course of her life. For once, a door has been opened. It cannot easily be closed again. And Martha had just walked through hers. The conference room had shifted into a fragile harmony. Words once lost in confusion now flowed through Martha's calm translations, and the atmosphere was no longer charged with frustration, but with the fragile beginnings of progress. Yet, as with any moment of change, resistance was close behind, lurking like a shadow. Martha stood near the table, her hands folded gently, her voice steady. She repeated the Sheikh's words, his dignity intact in every syllable she carried into English. The executives leaned in, pens poised, heads nodding, relief visible on their faces. But not all of them. In the corner, one man's jaw tightened. His name was Robert Halloway, Senior Vice President, a man who had built his career on command and control. His tailored suit was sharp, his shoes polished to a gleam, his posture straight with an air of authority that demanded deference. To him, Martha was not a bridge, not a savior of negotiations, but a disruption. Her cleaner standing among executives, bending rules that had taken men like him decades to carve. When Martha translated another phrase, the Sheikh's insistence on respect being more valuable than money, Robert leaned forward, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "This is inappropriate," he said, his tone clipped, cold, dismissive. "She is not part of the negotiation team. She should not even be in this room." The words dropped heavy, like stones into water. The fragile balance trembled. Martha felt her chest tighten. She had expected resistance, yet the sting of those words pierced deeper than she wanted to admit. It wasn't just his voice. It was the way his eyes slid past her, as though she were nothing but an interruption, as though her very presence were a mistake to be corrected. She had felt this gaze countless times before, on buses, in grocery stores, in workplaces where her worth was measured only in what she could clean or carry. But here, in this moment, it hurt differently. She had just proven her value, and still it wasn't enough. The silence stretched long. No one spoke. The executives shifted in discomfort, avoiding Martha's eyes, unwilling to challenge Robert's authority. She felt herself shrinking, the old instinct of retreat pressing against her ribs. She could step back, return to her cart, and disappear once more into the halls of invisibility. That would be safer. That would be expected. But then the Sheikh moved. His chair creaked as he leaned forward, his dark eyes steady and unyielding. He looked directly at Robert, his expression calm yet laced with something sharp, something immovable. When he spoke, his voice was low but carried the weight of centuries. He said in deliberate Arabic, "Thank you for giving me voice." The words were simple, but they filled the room with unexpected warmth. Martha translated, her voice soft, almost trembling. And as she spoke, her eyes met the Sheikh's. For the first time that day, she felt not only seen but valued. The Sheikh's gaze did not waver. It was as though he had decided that this woman, invisible to the rest, was the only one who had truly acknowledged his dignity. To him, Martha was not an intruder. She was essential. Martha lowered her eyes slightly, not from shame but from the effort of holding back tears. That acknowledgement, so simple and yet so profound, landed deep inside her. For years she had been treated as if her presence meant little. Now a man whose influence stretched across nations had thanked her, Not the executives, not the CEO, but her. Robert leaned back in his chair, his lips pressed thin, but he said nothing more. The silence that followed was different now. It was not the silence of invisibility, but of unspoken recognition, the kind that settled in when truth had been laid bare and could not be denied. The CEO finally broke it. "Martha, if you are willing, please continue." The words carried no grand flourish, no apology for the slight she had endured, but they were a request, and in them was something new. Respect. Not complete, not yet, but real enough to feel. Martha straightened her shoulders. She continued. Her voice returned to steady rhythm, carrying Arabic into English with the grace her father had instilled in her long ago. Each phrase she spoke rebalanced the room, transforming chaos into dialogue. And yet beneath her calm exterior, a storm still lingered. She could feel the weight of Robert's disdain pressing against her back, the doubt that had nearly silenced her earlier, now whispering again. She remembered every moment in her life when she had been dismissed, overlooked, reduced to less than she was. The ache of those memories pulsed within her, even as she stood proving them wrong. But the Sheikh's words, "Thank you for giving me voice," burned brighter. They anchored her. They reminded her that her father's lessons had not been wasted, that her life had not been invisible, that her existence carried meaning even in the rooms where no one expected it. As the negotiations stretched on, Martha found herself listening not only to words, but to the currents beneath them. She understood the Sheikh's pauses, the dignity in his silences, the layers of respect woven into his phrasing. She also heard the executive's desperation, their eagerness to salvage what pride remained. She became not only a translator of language, but of intention, bridging not just words, but humanity. Still, the resistance lingered. Robert's glare did not fade, and Martha knew there would be consequences. Men like him did not easily yield to shifts in power. Yet for the first time in years, she felt strong enough to withstand it. When the session finally adjourned, the room carried a different weight than when it had begun. The executives rose with relief. The Sheikh inclined his head in quiet approval, and Martha stood by the wall, her heart pounding but her spirit steady. For once, she had not retreated. For once, she had faced resistance and remained standing. She knew battles lay ahead. She knew Robert's words would not be the last attempt to put her back in her place. But she also knew something else, something far stronger. She had spoken, she had been heard, and no one, not even Robert Halloway, could take that away. The meeting resumed after the brief pause caused by Robert's cutting words, and though the tension remained, something deeper had shifted in the atmosphere. The Sheikh had spoken, Martha had translated, and even the most reluctant executives could no longer deny that her presence was indispensable. They were men used to control, men who thrived on numbers, contracts, and strategies, but now they found themselves relying on a 68-year-old cleaning woman who had been invisible to them just yesterday. That realization, though unspoken, was undeniable. Martha stood near the edge of the table, her hands resting gently against one another. She did not force herself forward, nor did she shrink away. She allowed her role to take shape naturally, her voice moving between languages with a clarity that seemed to smooth the jagged edges of mistrust. Her Arabic was not just functional, it carried rhythm, dignity, and an understanding that transcended vocabulary. The Sheikh's tone found its proper weight in English through her, and the executive's stiff words softened when carried into Arabic by her patient cadence. The CEO, a man named Charles Whitmore, observed closely. He had been skeptical at first, but he could not ignore the difference she was making. Each time Martha spoke, the Sheikh's face relaxed slightly, and the atmosphere in the room became less adversarial, more human. At one point, Charles leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and said quietly, "Martha, please continue with us." His tone lacked the arrogance that often accompanied his words. Instead, there was respect, hesitant perhaps, but real. For Martha, the sound of her own name spoken in that room carried a strange power. It had been years since her name had been used with such intention in this building. She was usually addressed as Miss, Ma'am, or not at all. Now, hearing it spoken as if she belonged here, she felt a warmth rise in her chest, a quiet affirmation that maybe, just maybe, her voice was beginning to carry weight. The Sheikh spoke again, his voice calm yet firm, laying out conditions that went beyond financial figures. He spoke of mutual respect, of cultural understanding, of dignity that could not be bought or sold. Martha translated his words, carefully preserving not only meaning but tone. The executives listened, some shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, others nodding slowly, as if realizing that business was not merely about contracts, but about people. For Martha, this was not just about language, it was about truth. She knew what it was to crave respect, to walk through rooms unseen, to be treated as though her existence held no value. And here was a man of immense wealth and influence, asking for the same thing she had silently longed for all her life: to be acknowledged, to be honored, to be heard. With every phrase she carried across the divide, she felt her father's lessons breathing through her, steadying her voice, reminding her that dignity is a universal language. At one moment, as she finished translating a particularly poignant statement, the room grew quiet. The sheikh had said, "Trust is not built by signatures on paper, but by the way we see one another when the ink has yet to dry." Martha repeated it in English, her voice low but resonant. The words hung in the air, echoing against the sterile walls of the conference room. Charles closed his notebook slowly, his expression thoughtful, and even Robert, who had earlier dismissed her, avoided her eyes. Something inside Martha shifted as she saw the effect. She realized that she was not just helping them communicate, she was shaping the very fabric of the meeting. Without her, the conversation would collapse into silence and misunderstanding. With her, it was not only alive but meaningful. She was not only heard, she was essential. But alongside that newfound respect came a fragile awareness of risk. She could feel it in the way some of the executives looked at her, part admiration, part discomfort. Change was never welcomed easily, and she knew that her presence challenged more than just a language barrier. It challenged the hierarchy itself, the invisible rules about who belonged where, about who had the right to speak. Still, Martha stood firm. Her voice did not waver. Her posture remained calm, and with every passing moment, she felt her father's presence beside her, not as memory, but as a living guidance. She recalled his words at the old kitchen table, "Language is power. Do not hide yourself." And now, in this towering building of glass and steel, those words found their truth. When the session finally paused for a short break, Charles approached her directly. He did not tower over her as some men often did. Instead, he lowered his tone as though speaking to an equal. "Martha," he said quietly, "you've helped us more in 1 hour than we managed in weeks of preparation. I want you to stay." Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. She had no desire to boast, no need to claim victory. What she felt instead was gratitude. Gratitude for the chance to honor her father, for the chance to show her daughter, though far away, that dignity had no age limit. As the executives left the room for coffee and whispered conversations, Martha stood alone for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. She gazed at the polished table, the tall windows that overlooked Manhattan, the faint reflection of herself in the glass. For the first time in her years of walking these halls, she saw herself not as invisible, but as part of the room. Respect had not fully arrived. It rarely does in a single moment, but it had begun. And beginnings, Martha knew, were powerful things. Somewhere deep within her, beneath the layers of humility and fear, courage began to settle like roots into soil. And though she could not yet see what would grow from it, she knew one truth beyond doubt. The silence that once defined her would no longer be the end of her story. When the executives filed back into the conference room, carrying steaming cups of coffee and folders brimming with numbers, the atmosphere seemed lighter. Martha had managed to restore balance where chaos had threatened to reign, and for a brief moment, there was a sense of possibility in the air. The sheikh's voice, calm and deliberate, flowed across the table, and Martha translated with the same quiet steadiness that had already altered the course of the morning. Yet even as the words passed through her lips, she felt a familiar pressure tightening inside her chest. Fear, that old companion, creeping back. It was not the fear of speaking. She had already done that. She had already crossed the threshold of silence. But the fear of being taken away, of being reminded abruptly and harshly that she did not belong. It began when one of the directors, a man younger than Robert but cut from the same cloth, raised his concern. His voice was smooth, controlled, but sharp enough to wound. "We should pause here," he said. eyes flicking briefly to Martha before returning to his colleagues. "I must question whether allowing a non-staff member to participate is legally sound. If these negotiations fall apart later, her involvement could compromise everything. We should consider removing her before this becomes complicated." The words landed like cold stones in Martha's stomach. The table shifted uneasily. The air thickened with hesitation. No one immediately challenged him. The CEO furrowed his brow but said nothing. And then, almost as if to underline the statement, one of the security guards standing by the door stepped forward. Martha felt her breath catch. She could see the guard's dark uniform in her periphery, the steady movement toward her. Not threatening, not fast, but undeniable. Her heart pounded as old memories stirred. Times when she had been dismissed from rooms, silenced in conversations, reminded of her place with no kindness in the gesture. The guard reached the corner of the table, waiting for confirmation. The director's words hung in the air, needing only a nod from someone with authority to become action. Martha's fingers tightened around the chair back where she stood, her palms damp with sweat. Inside her, two voices clashed. One urged her to step back, to go quietly, to avoid the shame of being dragged away from a room where she did not belong. The other voice, softer, older, but stronger, whispered her father's lesson once more. "Do not hide yourself." Still, fear held her in its grip. She could feel her throat closing, the weight of years of invisibility pressing down again. Would they really remove her? Would her brief moment of recognition end here in humiliation? Would her daughter, if she ever found out, remember not the courage of speaking, but the shame of being silenced again? The sheikh had been watching closely. He had noticed the shift in tone, the guard's movement, the trembling silence that filled the room. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in disappointment. And then he spoke, his Arabic deep and unwavering, his words ringing with authority. "Where I come from," he said, "a voice that brings understanding is never cast aside." Martha's throat loosened, and she translated, her voice softer at first, but growing firmer with each word. As the English filled the room, the weight shifted again. The executives looked uncomfortable, caught between protocol and the undeniable truth in his statement. The guard froze, waiting for instruction, but none came. Slowly he stepped back. Martha's heart beat hard against her ribs, her breath unsteady. She had not moved, not spoken on her own behalf, and yet she felt the sheikh's words as if they had been her own. Gratitude welled up inside her, so deep it was almost painful. For the second time that day, he had stood for her when others would not. But the fear did not vanish completely. Even as she resumed her role, even as the negotiation continued, she knew the danger was not gone. There would always be those who wanted her silent, those who saw her as an intruder rather than a bridge. She could feel Robert's disapproval still burning from across the table, and the younger director's suspicion lingering like a shadow. Her voice remained steady, but inside she trembled. She thought of her daughter, of the nights when she had tucked her in with stories of her grandfather's country, of the language that had once seemed like a secret gift, but now had become her shield. She thought of what example she wanted to leave behind. Was it one of retreat or of persistence? The meeting pressed on. Contracts were reviewed, terms debated, the slow rhythm of business reclaiming its ground. Yet Martha's focus drifted between the words she translated and the weight of the moment that had nearly undone her. She realized how fragile her place still was, how easily it could be taken away with a single command. But she also realized something else. She was no longer powerless. She had allies now, unexpected ones, and her courage had already reshaped the course of events once thought doomed. The fear remained, yes, but so did the courage. Both lived inside her now, entwined like roots that could not be separated. When the meeting adjourned for the afternoon, Martha lingered near the window. The city sprawled out beneath her like a restless sea. She felt drained, her body heavy, her mind replaying the near removal again and again. Yet beneath the exhaustion, a quiet resolve pulsed. Fear had returned, but courage had not left. And in that fragile balance, Martha understood something profound. Bravery is not the absence of fear. It is standing when fear tells you to sit. It is speaking when silence seems safer. And she knew with a clarity that steadied her trembling hands that she would not step back again. When the guard stepped back into place and the executives shifted in uneasy silence, Martha felt as if the entire room had exhaled. The crisis had passed, but her heart still carried the echo of fear. She lowered her gaze to the table, letting her breath steady, when suddenly the Sheikh's voice rose again. But this time he did not speak to the CEO, nor to the directors who sat fidgeting with their pens and notes. He turned his face toward Martha, his dark eyes resting directly on her. The room fell still as he addressed her in Arabic. His words were not sharp like before, nor weighed with negotiations. They carried something gentler, almost personal. "Where did you learn our tongue?" he asked. Martha blinked, caught off guard. For a moment she felt the weight of 24 eyes pressing on her. Her throat tightened. She was supposed to be invisible, supposed to fade back into her place as soon as the words were translated. Now she was being drawn into the center of the story itself. Her lips parted slowly, and in Arabic, the language that had lived in her bones since childhood, she answered, "From my father. He was from Algeria. He taught me not only words, but to listen, to respect, to honor every culture." The Sheikh's expression softened, his eyes searching hers with a quiet recognition. He nodded once, solemnly, and in that gesture there was more than acknowledgement. There was kinship. The executives, confused, turned to Martha expectantly, waiting for her to interpret, but for a fleeting moment she lingered in the exchange as if the world had shrunk to just two people, an aging woman who had spent her life unseen, and a man of immense power who now looked at her with respect. Finally, she translated her own words into English. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. "I learned it from my father. He wanted me to understand more than words. He wanted me to know the value of listening." The room shifted. The executives glanced at one another, uncomfortable yet touched by the unexpected intimacy of her revelation. For years, they had seen Martha pushing her cart, polishing their floors, emptying their bins. They had never wondered what she carried inside, what history had shaped her, what wisdom lingered in her quiet eyes. And now, with one simple sentence, they glimpsed a world they had never bothered to ask about. Martha felt her chest grow warm with memory. She remembered her father's hands, strong, calloused yet gentle, as he guided her small fingers along the lines of Arabic letters on scraps of old newspaper. She remembered the stories he told of the marketplace in his childhood, where spices filled the air and every vendor had a story worth hearing. She remembered the way he laughed when she mispronounced a word, not with ridicule but with joy, and how he would always remind her that mistakes were part of learning. He had died when she was still young, yet his voice had never left her, and now, in this gleaming tower of glass and steel, his lessons had returned to life. She looked around the room, seeing not only the executives but the reflection of her younger self, the girl who once sat wide-eyed at the kitchen table, soaking in a culture that felt both foreign and hers. That little girl had grown into a woman who had scrubbed floors, raised a daughter and buried a husband. But through it all, her father's gift had remained, waiting for the day it would matter. And here it was. The Sheikh spoke again, his tone carrying a quiet reverence. "Then he gave you something precious. You honor him now." Martha translated his words, but as she did, her voice quivered. They were simple, but they filled her with a depth of feeling she had not expected. Her father, long gone, seemed present again in that moment. She could almost feel his hand on her shoulder, steady and reassuring. The executives, though still cautious, listened more carefully now. The negotiation no longer felt like a sterile transaction. For the first time, humanity had slipped into the space between their words. They were no longer only discussing numbers and terms. They were witnessing a story, Martha's story, her father's legacy, the bridge of culture and memory that had somehow brought them all into the same room. For Martha, the moment was both terrifying and liberating. She had revealed a piece of herself, something deeply private. Yet, instead of being dismissed, it had been received with respect. For once, her past was not something to keep hidden, but something that gave her strength. She looked down at her hands, still rough from years of scrubbing floors, and thought of how those same hands had once traced the curves of Arabic letters as her father taught her. She had believed for so long that her life had been defined by the work of survival, keeping homes clean, raising her daughter, making ends meet. But now she saw that every piece of her story, even the quiet ones, had led her here. The Sheikh had asked where her voice came from, and in answering she realized that her voice had always been with her, waiting for the right moment to emerge. As the meeting resumed, the tension did not disappear entirely, but it had softened. The executives no longer looked at her as an intruder. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and respect, perhaps even shame for having overlooked her for so long. The sheikh, however, did not look at her with curiosity. He looked at her with understanding, as if recognizing in her a mirror of his own journey, someone who knew the weight of dignity, the sting of invisibility, and the power of language to bridge what pride and money could not. When the session ended that afternoon, Martha walked out of the conference room not with her cart, but with her head a little higher. She could feel the eyes that followed her, not dismissive now, but searching, questioning, perhaps even admiring. She did not seek their approval. What she carried with her was far greater. She carried her father's legacy, alive again in her voice. And though she did not yet know what tomorrow would bring, she knew one truth with unshakable certainty. She was no longer invisible. She was her father's daughter, and the world had finally heard her. The following morning, the building seemed different. It was not the marble floors that gleamed or the glass walls that reflected the sunrise, but the way people looked at Martha when she arrived. No one spoke openly, but glances lingered longer than usual. The receptionist, who had once offered her only a hurried nod, now gave her a hesitant smile. The security guard by the elevator straightened his shoulders when she walked past, almost as if to acknowledge her presence. Subtle changes, fragile as morning light, but real nonetheless. Martha pushed her cart through the hallway as she had done for years, yet inside she carried something new, a current of nervous anticipation. The sheikh had not left after yesterday's tense exchange. He had demanded that the negotiations continue, and more than that, he had insisted she remain in the room. That insistence alone had shaken the executives. It was one thing for her to speak by accident, another for her to be requested directly by the man whose signature could mean millions. She had not slept much the night before. Memories of her father returned to her in waves, his voice guiding her through lessons, his gentle insistence that she never shrink from her worth, his pride when she spoke her first full sentence in Arabic, without hesitation. She had whispered his words again and again before bed, "Do not hide yourself." They had steadied her heart. Now, as the clock struck 9, she found herself once more in the conference room. The table gleamed with freshly polished wood, stacks of documents neatly aligned, glasses of water untouched. The executives were already seated, their faces tight with the strain of a negotiation that had stretched far longer than planned. Some still looked at her with reluctance, as though her very presence was an inconvenience, but others, including Charles Whitmore, the CEO, had begun to see her differently. He greeted her with a respectful nod, one that carried more weight than any words. The sheikh entered soon after, his robes trailing lightly across the floor, his expression as composed as always. Yet when his eyes found Martha, he inclined his head, a gesture so small yet filled with meaning. He had chosen her. He had placed trust in her. That thought alone steadied her trembling hands. The negotiations began slowly, with numbers exchanged, projections debated, and terms adjusted. Martha translated each phrase, her voice bridging not just languages, but intentions. She listened carefully, shaping each sentence so that its meaning carried respect. She felt almost as though her father's spirit was beside her, guiding her through each word, reminding her that language was not about perfection, but about connection. Hours passed. At moments, the tension threatened to rise again, when one executive pressed too hard for concessions, when the sheikh grew silent, his patience tested. Each time, Martha's steady presence pulled the conversation back from collapse. She carried nuance, she softened sharpness, she ensured dignity remained intact on both sides. At one critical point, the sheikh leaned forward, his voice low but firm, and spoke in Arabic words that made Martha's breath catch. "I will not sign unless I know respect will last beyond this table." She repeated his statement in English, her voice calm but resolute. The executives shifted in their seats, realizing the depth of what he required. It was not only numbers, not only contracts, it was recognition, lasting recognition. For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy and expectant. It was Charles who finally broke it. He leaned forward, clasped his hands, and said, You are right. This partnership cannot survive without respect. We will honor that. His words were not scripted. They carried weight because they were real. Martha translated his statement, and the sheikh's eyes softened. He gave the faintest nod, then spoke again, slower this time, as if measuring each word. He agreed to the terms, provided his dignity was not compromised. The air in the room changed. The executives exchanged quick glances, relief flickering in their eyes. They had been on the edge of losing everything, yet now the deal was alive again. Martha's translations had not only kept the conversation going, they had transformed it into something human, something both sides could believe in. At last, papers were signed, pens gliding across crisp pages that only hours before had seemed destined to remain blank. The sheikh's signature sealed the agreement, and the executives exhaled almost in unison. Some clapped softly against the table, others leaned back in their chairs as though a great weight had been lifted. Martha stood quietly at the side, her heart heavy with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. She had not sought applause, but as the room filled with discreet acknowledgement, she felt a swell of emotion rise within her. Her eyes stung with tears she fought to hold back. For so many years, she had walked unnoticed through these halls, and today, her voice had saved them. Charles rose from his seat, turned toward her, and gave a firm nod. "Martha," he said, his tone full of sincerity, "you've done more for us than we could have imagined. Thank you." Her lips parted, but no words came. She only bowed her head slightly, her hands folded before her. She felt the tears pressing harder, but she held them in. This moment was too sacred, too precious, to be broken by anything but silence. The sheikh's eyes met hers once more before he left the room. "You honored your father," he said softly in Arabic. She translated for the others, but in her heart, she knew those words were not meant for them. They were meant for her alone. As the room emptied, Martha remained for a moment standing in the quiet. The city skyline stretched beyond the tall windows, bathed in the afternoon sun. She looked at her reflection faintly mirrored in the glass, the lines of age on her face, the wear of years in her posture, but also the strength that had carried her here. For the first time in her long life of silence, she knew without doubt she had mattered. She had made a difference not with force or wealth, but with the gift her father had placed in her hands long ago. And though she did not yet know what doors this day had opened, she felt certain of one thing. This was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. The conference room, now emptied of its tension, carried a softer stillness. Documents had been signed, pens carefully capped, and glasses of water half drunk stood forgotten on the polished table. The men who had spent the morning shifting uncomfortably in their chairs now walked with lighter steps, their relief visible in the slope of their shoulders and the looseness of their smiles. They spoke in low tones, congratulating one another, but beneath their voices there was something unspoken, the realization that none of it would have been possible without Martha. She lingered at the edge of the room, unsure whether she should stay or slip away. Her instinct, sharpened by decades of invisibility, told her to vanish before anyone noticed her too long. Yet her heart, steady but heavy, urged her to wait, to see if anyone would truly acknowledge what had taken place. For a moment, she thought she would leave unseen once more. She turned slightly toward the door, her hand brushing against the cart that had been waiting faithfully in the hall. But then, a voice, deep and steady, called her back. "Martha!" She froze. The sound was unfamiliar. Not the casual tone of a passing greeting, not the clipped command of someone requesting a task, but something else. When she turned, she saw him, Robert Halloway, the very man who had dismissed her earlier, his words still fresh in her memory like a bruise that had not faded. His sharp suit was still impeccable, his posture rigid, but his face carried something different now. The hardness was gone. He walked toward her slowly, each step deliberate, as though he were weighing every word before speaking. The other executives fell silent, their eyes following the unlikely moment unfolding before them. Martha's pulse quickened. She had braced herself for dismissal, for another reminder that she did not belong. But the expression in Robert's eyes was not disdain. It was something she had not expected to see from him: humility. When he reached her, he did not tower above her as before. He paused, adjusted his stance, and spoke in a voice quieter than the one he had used to command the room. "You saved everything today," he said, his words carrying no hesitation. "I was wrong not to see it earlier. I was wrong not to see you earlier." Martha blinked, her breath catching in her chest. She had heard apologies in her life, but rarely ones that carried such weight. This was not a polite gesture, not an empty courtesy. It was recognition, overdue, perhaps reluctant, but real. For a moment she did not respond. Her heart was full of memories, the countless times she had been passed by without a glance, the years of being treated as if her voice did not exist. And now, standing before the man who had dismissed her most harshly, she was finally seen. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady. "Thank you," she said simply, because more than words, it was the acknowledgement itself that mattered. Robert's eyes lingered on hers, then lowered slightly as though in respect. He gave a short nod and stepped back. The moment was brief, but it was enough to shift something inside Martha that had been waiting for years. The CEO approached next, his presence calmer, more open. He extended his hand, not as a superior but as an equal. Martha hesitated only for a second before taking it, her hand rough from years of cleaning, his hand firm with authority. "We owe you more than we can say," Charles told her, "and I hope this is only the beginning." Her throat tightened again. She wanted to answer, to tell him she had spent her life never expecting beginnings, only routines, but all she managed was a quiet nod, her eyes shimmering. As the men began to disperse, Martha remained still, her heart both light and heavy. She was not used to being the center of anyone's attention, yet today she had been the turning point of everything. The Sheikh's voice, Robert's apology, Charles's gratitude, each moment had carved itself into her memory. For years she had been invisible. Today she was undeniable. When the last of them left, Martha stepped closer to the tall windows. The city sprawled out before her, alive with movement, cars weaving through streets, people rushing on sidewalks, lights blinking in office towers. She watched them quietly, her reflection faint in the glass. She saw herself as she was, a woman marked by age, by work, by the weight of years. But she also saw something more, the glimmer of dignity restored, the trace of pride long buried but now uncovered. She thought of her daughter, of the conversation they would share that evening. How would she explain this day? How could she put into words the moment she had stepped out of silence and into recognition? She imagined her daughter's face, her eyes wide, her voice trembling with pride. That thought alone steadied her trembling hands. As she finally left the conference room, her cart waiting faithfully in the hallway, Martha carried no papers, no contracts, no signatures. What she carried was far greater, the unexpected recognition of her worth. And though the world outside had not yet changed, she knew that her world had. For the first time in a long life of invisibility, she had been seen not as what she did, but as who she was. And once seen, she knew she could never be unseen again. When Martha left the building that evening, the streets of Manhattan glowed with their usual rhythm. Taxis rushing past, the distant wail of sirens, pedestrians wrapped in coats and scarves against the chill. Yet the city felt strangely quiet to her. She walked with measured steps, her cart trailing behind her, until she stored it away in the maintenance room. Usually, the end of her shift left her body aching, her spirit dulled by routine. But tonight she carried something else, a sense that her life had cracked open in ways she could not yet understand. At home in the Bronx, her small apartment welcomed her with the familiar scent of chamomile tea and worn wood. Her cat brushed against her ankles, purring as if sensing the change in her. Martha set her bag down, loosened her scarf, and sat in her favorite chair by the window. She let her mind replay the day, the Sheikh's trust, the apology from Robert, the quiet gratitude in Charles's voice. It felt like a story that belonged to someone else, someone braver, younger, more prepared, yet it was hers. She reached for the framed photograph of her father that rested on the shelf. His eyes, frozen in sepia tones, carried the same strength she had felt guiding her that day. "Papa," she whispered softly, her voice trembling with fatigue and pride. They heard me. They truly heard me. Sleep did not come easily. Her thoughts wandered between fear and hope. What if today was an exception, a fleeting accident? What if tomorrow she returned to being invisible, her voice once again swallowed by silence? And yet, another thought glimmered. What if it was the beginning of something more? That fragile question followed her into restless dreams. The next morning, the air inside the skyscraper carried an unusual charge. Martha sensed it as soon as she entered, a subtle shift, like the stillness before rain. People in suits glanced her way more often, their expressions softer, less hurried. Some nodded in greeting, small gestures, but to Martha they felt monumental. For once she was not just a shadow gliding past polished offices, she was a presence. Midway through her shift, as she polished the brass handles outside the executive suite, the receptionist approached her with a message. "Mr. Whitmore would like to see you in his office, alone." Martha froze, her rag still in her hand. A familiar rush of dread rose inside her. Was this the moment of reprimand? Had she crossed a line after all? Her stomach tightened as she followed the receptionist down the hall, her steps heavy, her palms damp. Charles Whitmore's office was a vast space with floor-to-ceiling windows that spilled light over leather chairs and a desk lined with orderly stacks of documents. He stood when she entered, a gesture that surprised her, and gestured toward a chair. "Please sit." Martha hesitated, then lowered herself slowly onto the seat, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She braced herself for disappointment, for the words that would undo the fragile recognition she had earned. Instead, Charles leaned forward, his voice calm but earnest. "Martha, yesterday you saved this company. I don't say that lightly. Without you, we would have lost not only a deal worth millions, but the trust of a man whose influence extends far beyond money." Her eyes dropped, her voice almost a whisper. "I was only doing what I could. I didn't mean to intrude." Charles shook his head. "No, you didn't intrude. You stepped in where no one else could, and you did it with grace and wisdom. You have something this company desperately needs: understanding, humility, the ability to connect across cultures. We overlooked you for too long. That ends now." Martha's heart pounded in her chest. She lifted her eyes, searching his face for signs of insincerity, but his expression was steady. "I would like to offer you a new role," he continued. "Not as cleaning staff, as a consultant. Someone who can help us prepare for negotiations with foreign clients. Someone who can train our team in cultural respect and communication. We need a bridge, Martha, and you are that bridge." Her breath caught. For a moment, she could not find words. A lifetime of invisibility clashed with the sudden possibility of being valued not for her labor, but for her wisdom. She thought of her father, of the countless hours he had spent teaching her words that once felt like secrets, never imagining they would shape her future. She thought of her daughter, of the pride that would light her eyes if she heard this. "But," Martha's voice trembled, filled with disbelief, "I am only a cleaner." Charles's eyes softened. "No, Martha. You are far more. You are exactly what we have been missing." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and unbidden. She looked down at her hands, hands that had scrubbed floors, carried heavy buckets, wiped away the dust of other people's lives. And now those same hands trembled with the possibility of a new beginning. For a long moment, silence filled the office, broken only by the hum of the city beyond the glass. Martha felt the weight of years pressing against her, but she also felt them lifting, as though the voice of her father whispered once again, "Do not hide yourself." Finally she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I can help, then yes." Charles smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Then it settled. "Welcome to your new role, Martha. This is only the beginning." As she left his office, the city skyline stretching endlessly before her, Martha felt the air around her change. The building no longer seemed like a place where she was invisible. It was a place where she had been seen, where she was beginning to belong in a way she had never dared to dream. That evening, as she sat across from her daughter at the small kitchen table, she would share the news. She could already imagine her daughter's tears, her proud smile, the way her hands would squeeze hers. But for now, Martha simply walked slowly through the halls, each step lighter than the last. She was no longer just part of the silence. She was becoming part of the story. That evening, the apartment was filled with the smell of lentils simmering on the stove and the faint sweetness of cornbread warming in the oven. The Bronx air outside was cool, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and children laughing on the street. Inside, Martha set the table with the care of ritual. 2 plates, 2 cups, cloth napkins folded neatly as her mother had always taught her. Her daughter Evelyn was coming over, and tonight was not like any other. When Evelyn arrived, her embrace was as warm as ever. She removed her coat, shaking off the city chill, and sat across from her mother. "You look different, Mama," she said, tilting her head as she studied her face. "Tired, but lighter somehow. What happened?" Martha sat down slowly, smoothing the napkin across her lap. For a moment she hesitated. How could she put into words the whirlwind of the last 2 days? The silence broken, the fear confronted, the respect finally earned. But then she remembered the Sheikh's words, her father's lessons, and the way her voice had carried across that cold conference room. She knew she could not keep this from her daughter. She began softly. "Evelyn, something happened at work, something I never imagined." She told her everything. How the Sheikh had spoken only in Arabic, how no one understood, how she had stepped forward despite the weight of fear pressing on her. She spoke of the tension, of Robert's dismissal, of the Sheikh's kindness, of the moment when her father's language became the bridge between worlds. Evelyn listened with wide eyes, her hands folded tightly together as though holding her breath through every turn of the story. When Martha finally spoke of Charles's offer, the role of consultant, the chance to step out of invisibility and into recognition, her daughter's eyes filled with tears. She reached across the table, taking her mother's hands in her own, pressing them firmly. "Mama," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling, I always knew there was more in you than anyone saw. I saw it when you helped me with my schoolwork even after long shifts, when you taught me patience, when you told me stories of Grandpa and his country. I saw it every day, and now the world sees it too." Tears welled in Martha's eyes, blurring her vision. She looked down at her hands, worn from years of labor, now wrapped in her daughter's firm grasp. "For so long, I thought my voice didn't matter," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I thought being invisible was my place. But now I see that even the quietest life holds something powerful, if only given a chance." They sat in silence for a moment, their hands entwined across the table, the lentils forgotten on the stove. The weight of years, of sacrifice, of silence unbroken, seemed to lift in that shared space between them. Evelyn squeezed her mother's hands again. "Mama, your story isn't just about you anymore. It's about every woman who was ever told to stay quiet, every person who was overlooked. You've shown them that it's never too late to be seen." Martha smiled faintly, the corners of her lips trembling. She thought of her father once more, of his insistence that knowledge must be carried with dignity. She thought of the Sheikh's nod, of the way his words had wrapped her father's lessons in honor. And she thought of the executives, their surprise, their gradual shift from dismissal to respect. She realized that her story had grown larger than herself. After dinner, when Evelyn had gone, Martha sat by the window with a cup of tea. The Bronx night stretched before her, the lights of the city flickering like stars scattered across the ground. She touched the window pane lightly, feeling the cool glass beneath her fingertips, and whispered, "Papa, I hope I made you proud." In the stillness, she felt as though he answered, not in words, but in presence. In the warmth that filled her chest, in the calm that settled over her heart, in the quiet certainty that he had been with her every step of the way. Martha leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. For years, she had believed her life was defined by silence, by service, by the invisibility of routine. But now she knew differently. She had discovered that dignity does not fade with age, that courage can rise even in the final chapters of a story, and that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones the world almost forgot to hear. Her daughter had been right. This was not only her story, it was the story of countless women who had lived quietly, faithfully, unseen, carrying within them histories, skills, and wisdom that the world never paused to notice. And now, because she had dared to step forward, at least one of those voices had been heard. As she drifted into rest, her heart lighter than it had been in years, Martha carried one certainty with her. It is never too late to be seen, never too late to speak, never too late to shine. And in her calm, gentle smile, there lived a truth that would outlast her, that even the quietest lives can leave legacies strong enough to echo across generations.